Hello there. So the topic that I felt moved to talk about today is one of knowledge, and how we can know something and how we learn things in general. I think it's a really important topic to everyone, in terms of how we're learning different subjects about the world, and that obviously affects and influences how we act, what our actions are, how we live, what jobs we do, what relationships we have, where we spend our money, what kind of food we buy, what kind of leisure activities we do, what holidays we have, what social groups we go to, what interests we partake in, the transport we choose to use, the clothes we choose to buy, the things we choose to fill our houses and our lives with, the energy and focus that we give things to. It affects all different aspects to our lives, our understanding of different subjects in life, whether that be language or philosophy, theology, science, or a variety of other subjects, too numerous even to mention, in fact. And indeed, it's also something on a personal level, which affects us all, our knowledge of each other. It forms the basis of all relationships in life, whether that's intimate relationships between partners, perhaps between husband and wife, or just between boyfriends and girlfriends, or between just friendships, between brothers, between sisters. It's the solid foundation of all relationships, having good, wholesome knowledge. And by that I mean, of course, true knowledge. A good relationship is founded on things that are truthful and honest. Whereas, of course, a bad relationship can be founded on dishonesty, on lies and deception. So how we discern which one is which, where there is truth and where there is deception, that's a critical thing for all of us to consider, especially when we are considering the nature of our different relationships, not just personal ones to each other, to friendships, to people that we're perhaps intimate with, but also to the wider world as well, to colleagues, to different businesses that we choose to associate with, to products that we buy, to areas that we choose to live in, to different social groups, how we relate to governments, how we relate to the police, to how we relate to educational systems, to various teachers, to different academic institutions, how we relate to different doctors and different medical practitioners, how we relate to all sorts of different things in the world, and the type of relationships we have are all based around our type of knowledge and our access and our ability to achieve a good sense of knowledge. So it is critical to examine how we do that and if we're capable of doing that sufficiently. We know, of course, what comes part and parcel with knowledge is ignorance, of course. That is to say that oftentimes we can believe something that turns out to be wrong, of course. And indeed, that can happen to all of us. But what I first of all want to talk about is a hierarchy of relationships that we have. And by that I mean where we have devoted sufficient time and energy and perhaps even money into a subject or even a person, then we're much more likely to be able to know that person much better. That doesn't always guarantee that we will, of course, but I'm saying we're much more likely to be an expert on a subject, of course. That stands to reason. However, that isn't always the case. But just to give you an example, if you are a professor in something and you have devoted perhaps many years studying a subject, you're much more likely to be proficient within that subject and knowledgeable about those ideas and the subjects around that subject perhaps too, than someone who hasn't studied it. And that's a reasonable idea. In the same manner that if you've lived with someone, if you've known them, if you've seen and spent time with them over a considerable period of time, if you've seen them in a variety of different circumstances, for example. You've seen them when life's going well and life's going badly. You know, you've seen them in ill health, you've seen them in good health. You know, you've seen what they're like amongst a crowd or a variety of different people, and what they're like on their own. You've seen what they're like in a variety of different jobs or in different places or in going through different challenges. So, you know, if you've spent a longer period of time with someone, stands to reason that you're more likely to know them more wholesomely, more fully, more totally. You're more likely to know the whole version of them rather than a small partial amount of them. So in terms of this hierarchy, you know, there are those that we have never known before, that we call strangers. When we first encounter someone to begin with, we know nothing about them. We start with a blank page, a clean slate, if you will. And then that's good. There's good and bad in that, because the good in that is that we don't have any false information about them to begin with. Unless, of course, we've heard rumours or hearsay that may be true or may not be. So sometimes we can feel we know someone from other people's views on them before we've even met them ourselves, of course. And that's quite normal, that's natural, and that does happen to us all. You know, we will have to consider whether those views about them are realistic and whether they're valid or not. But before you've met someone or you've encountered them, you know, you don't really know them at all. We are essentially estranged from each other. If I don't hear about someone and I haven't met them, they're a complete stranger to begin with. And then until perhaps I become aware of them, either in person or through hearing about them, perhaps through some story that someone's told, and then I've got to assess whether I think what is true or not about what they've said. So we start off as strangers, and then there's a hierarchy you gradually move up if you spend more time and energy with someone, and that tends to progress to casual acquaintances, where you may have met them a few times and you've invested a little time and energy, so you feel you know them a little bit at least. Well, of course, you can sometimes feel that you get to know someone very quickly. So, you know, the amount of time you spend with someone doesn't always indicate how well you know someone. Indeed, you could know someone for very many years and they could be extremely proficient in hiding a double life. They could be extremely professional and skilled at deception, and you could sort of years or decades later discover that the person you thought you know wasn't that person at all. And sadly that does happen to many people. You know, they discover double, treble or quadruple lives sometimes, and we perhaps all had various experiences and certainly heard stories about such things in life. So we must be wary before assuming, just because we have spent so much time with someone, that we know them much better. But it's a natural tendency that you do get to know someone better generally, but not always, when you've spent more time and energy with them. Indeed, if you're locked in a cell with someone for many, many years, you'll probably get to see the very good and the very bad about them. As they say, familiarity breeds contempt. And that can be the case, because if you're seeing someone long enough, you'll not only get to see the good side of them, but you'll have to see the bad side. And that is much more likely and realistic when you're seeing someone in a variety of different contexts, but also over a very long extended period of time. You're bound to see all their flaws much more. Why is that? Because over a short time, when we see someone, it's quite easy for most of us to be acting for a short time. I know I do it sometimes. So, and that's okay to do that, depending on what type of acting it is. So I will, when I'm seeing someone for a few times, especially on the first few encounters, I'll be on my best behaviour, I'll make a real effort. I certainly won't go out and tell them the worst things that have either been done to me or that I've done to other people. You know, that's something that you kind of reserve for telling someone that you've known fairly well. And I will tend to tell those intimate things to someone that I consider a closer friend rather than a casual acquaintance or a stranger. And I think that's quite natural. I think a lot of people do that, although there are even exceptions to that, perhaps. Perhaps if someone's quite desperate and they just need someone to outpour onto and talk to, perhaps if they're very drunk and reckless, or perhaps, if they're talking to a counsellor who they feel they trust, and they've been recommended to, and they haven't spent an awful amount of time with. So there are exceptions to that rule. But generally, we will reveal intimate secrets about our lives to people that we feel that we know sufficiently, because we can trust them with that information sufficiently. But of course, we do all make mistakes, and we have tendencies to get that wrong sometimes. But the longer we know someone, the more we know someone, we are bound to see the good and bad about them. As they say, better the devil you know. Because if you know someone's bad points, you can account for them. At least what their capabilities are. You're more at risk from somebody who you don't know the faults of and the flaws of, potentially, than someone who you know the faults of. Because you can account for them, because you can mitigate those risks potentially. If somebody has a history of stealing things, then you're not going to leave them in charge, hopefully, of your bank account, or leave large sums of money around to tempt them. You're going to be a bit more wary of trusting them with large sums of anything like that. If somebody's prone to temper, perhaps, then you'll be more wary and notice when their temper begins to sort of gradually get worse, and you may sort of be able to take action sooner on that and sort of guard against yourself. Or you may not see them, or you may limit your contact with them if you notice that aggressive tendencies have resurfaced in them once again. So, not to say that that's foolproof or guarantee that you can guard against those risks, no. But at least if you know about those risks, you at least have some chance of mitigating against them, of limiting the potential for it to get out of hand. Whereas if you don't know that someone's potentially doing something, it's quite hard then to guard against it. However, there's a middle ground as well, and that is where you have suspicions that someone may be doing something. You think that somebody could have taken money because they visited, but then there were other people that visited, and you have your doubts who it was. So it's quite reasonable. Sometimes you have reasonable suspicion about someone, but you lack sufficient proof and evidence to say and to know. And that's where it's really hard to know. And of course, you have to give someone the benefit of the doubt and to say, it could be them, it might not be them, and that's where you sort of you don't want to sort of spread false rumours about anyone, because that's libel, because it's wrong and it harms relationships and destroys people's lives. But at the same time, you don't want to entrust someone too much that could be taking advantage of you, and an opportunist that takes advantage of others that potentially are vulnerable. So you need to be wary. You need to take, and I think it's taking sensible precautions, not going too far, but not taking too little precautions either, I suppose. But what I want to come on to talk about is how we learn things. And when we're studying a subject, or even a person, that is, we feel over the time that we're getting to know something better. That can be the case, and indeed hopefully it is the case when we're learning things. But it's not always. It depends what we're learning and how we're learning it. If I have someone who is teaching me things that actually are wrong, either they're deliberately teaching me wrong things, but more often than not is the case that they've mistakenly been taught things they believe are true but turn out to be false, then they could be teaching me things that are wrong, and I in turn could be teaching other people things that are wrong. And that of course does happen in life. So when we're learning things, we could be learning things that are wrong sometimes, or we could be learning things that are right. So if we're learning things that are wrong, the more time and energy I invest into that, I could be spending lifetime learning something, and actually, it turns out to be wrong. So I'm actually becoming gradually more and more and increasingly ignorant. If you want to look at it this way, in terms of a metaphor, in terms of knowledge, you're building a pyramid. You're building it higher into the sky. It's getting, taller and taller. It's going up. But in terms of ignorance, you're digging a hole that gets deeper and deeper and deeper. So I think we need to be aware when we're learning things to consider whether we know absolutely something is true beyond any doubt, or whether we suspect it might be, whether we just believe that it's true, and what evidence that we have to know how true something is or not, and whether we're able to say what level of how we can say we know it's true, what level of evidence we have that can support that. Okay, so how do we go about assessing the truth of something? I mean, that's a fundamental question, isn't it, really? If you consider, the idea that, we could become increasingly more ignorant in something, the more energy and time we devote to something. And many people will say that about various subjects. If I believe in something as a pseudoscience, for example, if I believe that, let me give you an example, astrology, something I don't believe in, but I think many people do. So many people say reading the stars and the position of the stars when you were born, that has some indication over your type of personality, your characteristics, and how you might live your life and what things you'll encounter day by day. I disagree with that. I think that's a deterministic philosophy, and I think that the other factors, environmental, social, and your own choices are what determines your life, and not the position of stars. Okay, so I disagree personally, and I think that's a pseudoscience. So I think the longer that people devote to astrology, not astronomy, the study of the position of the stars and the science, to distinguish it from that, but astrology, I think that's the one. So personally, my view is that the more and the longer people study things like that, sadly, I feel that they're just learning more false information that isn't real of any great benefit to their lives. Not to say that the method through learning that they can't be bonding with other people, enjoying their time, and doing other things that are beneficial. And they might find it a pleasing thing to do to some extent. But if that knowledge itself, I believe, is not useful, is false, and if they're using that to sort of live their life by, I think that will ultimately be a bad thing. They, on the other hand, the people that believe in it and the practitioners of it would think the contrary. They would say, it's me that's false, and that I've got my false beliefs, and that they are learning and increasing in their knowledge of something, and that they are, graduating and becoming more proficient as they study it more. So, who and how do you believe what's true? Are the astrologers true in their beliefs and in what they say is their knowledge? Or am I true in my beliefs and saying that it's a false and pseudo subject? And I may believe that about many other things. Well, I think you've got to sort of investigate that and study it yourself and compare it to your life experiences. What have been your experiences in life? Can you look at it in a methodical, scientific manner? Are you able to deduce it using rationality and logic? Employing logic is useful because it's objective, it's non-prejudicial, it's not biased, so you can apply it to various different subjects and people alike. So I found that, there are the reasons I disagree, for example, with astrology is that if I did a test and I read out the different star signs to people, and I've done that before, I've read the star signs of others, and I found that they've generally agreed with what it was, even though it wasn't their actual star sign. And what that proved to me is that there's a tendency to write universalisms, which is basically that they're writing things down that are generally applicable to anyone. For example, you will meet a stranger in the future. You may encounter problems in the future. You may go on a journey in the future. But all these are very general, vague statements that could be applied equally to anyone. And they're so vague, in fact, that they could be interpreted by anyone, in fact. I have to say that my study of that was just limited to a few astrological readings and therefore not necessarily true of them all. However, I did a wide enough sample to be certain that was true. And what I've also done scientifically, I felt, was to read the star signs at the end of the day rather than at the beginning. So I can then look back and say, is that what happened? Was that a very specific account of actually what occurred in the day? And I found that it wasn't, to be quite truthful. And it was really important to do that at the end, not the beginning, because what I realised is if you look at it in the beginning, then it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy, and that is where you know the outcome and the conclusion that you want to find at the beginning, so you can selectively go out and seek the evidence that confirms your own bias. So that is a psychological mistake that we all make and have tendencies to do sometimes, so that we're selective in the evidence that we seek out, so that we're just seeking out things that will confirm the conclusions that we want to find. It's a type of bias that we need to be cautious about. But there are various methods to overcome those if we're aware of that during the scientific processes. So it's very important to sort of be aware of those various scientific protocols and processes of evaluating how we're studying various subjects and whether they are held accountable to consistent processes and consistent scientific principles. They're just a couple, to name a few off the top of my head, but there's lots of other ones. But I think that you need to be careful about employing those rigorously in any subject that you study, really. So there's some methods. Talking to other people in a variety of different sources. So it's not limiting your sources to a select group of people that perhaps all think the same thing. It's talking to other people from a variety of different backgrounds. Yes, people that are studying that subject, but also people that perhaps study the subject from other different schools of thought that can offer you different perceptions of how you look at things. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be any truer or any falser, but it means that you can at least compare and contrast things to a variety of different sources. So it's varying your sources as much as you can. In terms of getting to know people, so if you find that you're investing a lot of time with someone, but you may have your doubts about someone, you may want to investigate how truthful a person is or not. So you might want to speak to a lot of other people, maybe other people that knew them. But you have to bear in mind, other people that know them could also be biased. If A has spread their lies to B, C and D, they may well have spread it to E, F and G as well, Or if there's a group of people that are all lying, or that are all genuinely mistaken, that have all been taught something that's wrong, but they all believe it is true, then going and speaking to other people within that group, that doesn't then help. For example, if I go back to my situation with astrologers, if I go and speak to other astrologers to find out what they think, they're all going to probably confirm that it's true and offer a variety of reasons. Good and essential that I do that, to investigate why they think it's true and what those variety of reasons are. But I also need to investigate and speak to other people that believe it's false to find out the reasons that they suspect and think that too, so that I can weigh up those different positions, the group of people that think it's true, those that think it's false, and perhaps there's those agnostic in the middle that aren't sure, and I need to consider their position and their reasons for that too. So that's what I mean by looking at a variety of sources, not limiting yourself to only the people that believe a certain thing, but also speaking to the people that disbelieve something too. So it's looking at arguments for and arguments against. And the people that disbelieve something or someone they're going to have those arguments against that, and they're going to have the reasons for that. Now, there may be good or there may be bad reasons, but unless you ask them and investigate that, you're not really going to know. So investigating things as far as you can helps. Speaking to a variety of sources from different people that believe different things, and allowing them the time to explain their positions clearly. That can be hard, because if we already have a belief that we're invested in, if I already believe in astrology as being false, I don't want to hear somebody sitting there giving a 3-hour lecture, or I don't want to hear 20 different people speaking about all their different reasons why they believe it is true, and why they believe it has got a good reason for their life, why their life experiences give them evidence to support that. But if I don't listen to that good reasoning, I can't answer and argue against it either. So it's in that listening to both sides of an argument that we are able to properly provide our own counterpoints, our own reasoning, our own reflections on their own points. And just to go back to a good metaphor, a court of law functions in this same manner. So let's say so-and-so is accused of something, then there naturally is a defence that will put the one case and the prosecution which will put the other side of the story. And you have to be capable of listening to both sides of a story. Just because you listen to someone and you give them the time and energy to speak, and you may invest a lot of time with them, that doesn't mean you're going to believe or be convinced by them. It means that you've allowed them to fully express themselves, and that you therefore have a better opportunity of assessing whether it's truthful or not. Employing all those scientific techniques, trying to look at it objectively, stepping back at it, and not allowing yourself to be persuaded by emotional techniques. Because, you know, people do employ various emotional techniques like blackmail, for example, or people will sort of like try to sort of make you angry and sort of like make that sort of drive you into a certain position, or even playing on your heartstrings, you know, and sort of using sort of emotional blackmail. So we need to be wary of emotional tactics too. But of course, we're naturally going to have some emotions on some subjects, you know, that can be really moving and that. And that's okay, and that's fine. But I think when we're coming to our verdicts on things, we need to try and be quite objective about things, take a step back from things, and assess things more neutrally if we're capable of doing. And you know, that can be very difficult depending on the situation. And in terms of our relations with others, you know, if we have a close relationship with someone and they're accused of a crime, say, we want to assess whether they have committed that crime or not. Well, now, we may have a close relationship with them, and it could be that we feel if they are accused, other people will look at us accused too, you know, guilty by association. It may well feel that we may feel we're tainted from that. So we may well feel driven to want to see their innocence out of fear of being associated with them, should it turn out they're guilty. It may well be that if they've lied to us over a significant amount of time, we've invested that time in believing that deception. So it becomes much harder for us to admit that we could have been wrong, because it takes great humility to say, you know what, not only could I have been wrong and mistaken in something, I could have been wrong over a long period of time. I could have been fooled. It's quite hard sometimes for us to admit that sometimes. And especially if we have an emotional connection to someone, it can be really devastating to know that we have, you know, we've been played, that our heart has been, you know, used and manipulated in that way. Nevertheless, as hard as it is, we need to somehow have that ability to assess them, to take a step back and to almost look at the situation as if we weren't a friend of theirs, to actually assess it as if we were an outsider, a stranger, looking at the situation from the outside. and to try and assess it as neutrally as we can. And after all, if we are to question them fairly, and it turns out that they are true, and what they're saying, was true, and that they sadly were falsely accused, it will be good that we have questioned them fairly, and that has revealed the truth about them. There's an old saying that the truth welcomes any fair questioning, but only the lie is afraid to be exposed. So if something is genuinely true, then it would welcome a fair questioning. But that, of course, means, is it fair? If we're bullying someone or harassing them, or we're employing, interrogation techniques, where we're just trying to overwhelm them, and push them or coerce them into saying something that's false, that's definitely unfair, and we're going to get false results from it anyway. So if we're employing really bad techniques to get the truth, then really somebody might just be telling us any old thing to get out of that situation, or just to give us information they feel that we want to know, or just because they're frightened of us, or just to avoid that conflict perhaps. However, if we're too light-hearted with them, if we just sort of allow them to sort of get away with anything, then it could well be that they feel that without any questioning whatsoever, that they can avoid that. They can spin us any old story and continue getting away with it. So it's about finding a way to question people, but to do it fairly. So I think the wrong way would be to avoid any questioning whatsoever if we have a genuine suspicion that a subject or a person could in any way be false. It's right, and it's a duty that we're bound to do, to question something fairly. We would be wrong to avoid the questioning, but we would be equally wrong to try and question something in a way that is over the top, that it is wrong, that is forcing or coercive in its nature, using things like harassment, using things, bad techniques that really don't respect the truthfulness of someone, don't respect their ability to actually to function well, and to actually what situation allows them to sort of be more honest. Whereas if we're sort of threatening someone, if you don't tell me the truth, I'll beat you up, or I'll do this to you, somebody's just going to be telling you anything, perhaps out of fear, rather than because it's truthful. So it's not always easy to do, but it's trying for each of us to negotiate what's fair questioning, and to try and employ that in our day-to-day situations with others, to avoid both unfair techniques of questioning, but also not to avoid questioning altogether.